So you've probably heard people talking about the paleo diet,
Oh,
right?
yeah, definitely.
This idea that maybe our ancestors, way back before farms and cities, were living healthier lives just by hunting and gathering.
Hmm.
It taps into this deep question. Was that life somehow? Well, better.
And that's a fantastic place to start because it gets right to the heart of what we're diving into today. If living as hunter-gatherers was potentially so good, why did humans ever make that huge shift to farming?
Yeah, why trade that varied diet and mobile life for fields of grain and domesticated animals? It seems like a big leap.
A monumental one.
And the material we've been exploring makes one thing immediately clear. This wasn't some like universal light bulb moment where everyone just decided, okay, let's plant crops.
Right, not at
It
all.
wasn't a sudden overnight revolution. It was slow, uneven.
Oh.
It unfolded across different parts of the world over thousands of years.
Absolutely. And our mission with this depth dive is to really unpack that complexity. We're looking at different perspectives on when this happened, where, how, and crucially, why this agricultural transition happened.
And ultimately, was it actually a positive or a negative thing for humanity, in the long run?
Exactly. That's the core question.
Okay, so let's start by grounding ourselves in the when, where, and how. Agriculture did emerge, obviously, in many places.
Yeah.
But one of the big takeaways from this research is that it wasn't some pre-programmed step in human evolution. It wasn't inevitable,
Right.
right?
It's such a crucial point. It was just one path humans ended up taking out of many possibilities. Many researchers think the process was likely slow, really gradual, and maybe even started quite unintentionally.
How so?
Well, imagine people living in a relatively settled spot, maybe processing wild grains near their homes. They drop some seeds, those seeds grow.
Oh.
And someone notices, hey, those plants we like are growing right here. That simple observation could have been the tiny spark, leading to deliberate cultivation over time.
That idea of it starting with something as simple as dropped seeds is pretty fascinating. And the research pinpoints a few areas where this transition seems to have happened independently, more or less around the same time frame. We're talking roughly 10,000 to 6,000 years ago.
That's the window, yeah. Places like Southwest Asia, often called the Fertile Crescent, that's the classic example, but also Central America, Northern China, New Guinea.
So multiple starting points.
Right. And once established in these core areas, agriculture began to spread. The material points to two main ways this happened.
Okay.
Either through actual farmers migrating, moving into new land and bringing their practices with them.
Settling new territory.
Exactly. Or through the exchange of ideas and goods along existing networks. Trade routes, interactions between groups.
So it wasn't just people moving, it was knowledge moving too. Tools, seeds for specific plants, maybe domesticated animal species.
And the know-how, how to actually farm with them.
A whole package deal sometimes.
Exactly. Though it's interesting to note, while it spread widely in Eurasia, agriculture didn't take hold everywhere.
Oh.
It didn't spread extensively throughout most of the Americas from those early centers. So that adds another layer of complexity to the story. Why there and not elsewhere?
Right. Okay. So that gives us a sense of the mechanics, when, where, how it started, how it spread. But what did this fundamentally change about human life?
Well, almost everything. The material we reviewed is clear. Settled farming revolutionized community structures, how people connected, our health, population sizes.
Even the environment, though you said that's maybe a whole other deep dive.
But focusing on human life, one of the most immediate and profound shifts was from, highly mobile hunter-gatherer bands to settled, fixed communities.
Living in one place all the time.
The research highlights that the family home itself became the central unit for pretty much everything, producing food, distributing it, consuming goods.
And we see that in the archaeology.
Yeah, things like the foundations of early dwellings found at sites like Jericho. They show this shift to prominent structures, people investing in a place.
And this wasn't just about having a house, right? Settled life allowed communities to become much more organized, and this is where we start seeing big changes in social structure.
And, importantly, the emergence of inequality.
Tell us about that.
This is a key point. When people are settled, some individuals or families gain the ability to accumulate more stuff, more wealth, more food, higher status than others.
Because they're not moving all the time, they can build things up.
Exactly. They start investing long-term in land, in permanent homes. This fosters a stronger sense of personal ownership of property.
And then there's surplus food.
Right. Once farmers could produce a surplus, growing more food than their own family needed just to survive day to day, that surplus freed up other people.
To do things besides farming.
Precisely. You could have individuals become full-time soldiers, or merchants, craftspeople, priests, even rulers, because someone else was growing their food.
So specialization starts happening?
Yeah, this division of labor, it's certainly enabled new professions and eventually complex societies, but as the material points out, it also created pretty rigid social hierarchies.
Based on what you did for a living.
Right. And this naturally led to new forms of conflict and inequality. It also notes a significant change in the role of women, often becoming more focused on raising children and domestic tasks within the home.
Okay, so major social shifts. What about health? You mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, and the research doesn't pull any punches here. There were some pretty dramatic impacts and often negative ones initially.
Like what?
Well, repetitive tasks common in early farming, think grinding grain for hours or bending over tending fields, put new kinds of stress on bones and muscles.
Different injuries than hunter-gatherers might get.
Exactly. Different wear and tear. And perhaps most significantly, settled life brought us into much closer, more constant contact with domesticated animals.
Okay, and that's bad because,
Pathogens, germs jumping from animal populations into human populations. This happened much more easily and frequently.
zoonotic diseases.
Right. Add to that denser human populations living cheek by jowl in villages and emerging cities. Well, you have the perfect conditions for infectious diseases to spread like wildfire.
Huh. Like illness spreading through a crowded school or office today, but maybe worse.
Kind of, but maybe on a more constant basis and with brand new diseases people had no immunity to. It was a major challenge.
Wow. Okay, so a big downside there. How did this settled life affect how people connected with each other? You mentioned networks changing.
Yeah, it's a complex picture. For many farmers living in small villages, their local networks, their neighbors, the people at a nearby market probably grew in terms of the sheer number of people they interacted with regularly.
More local connection.
But at the same time, their geographic network, the physical distance they traveled day to day, likely shrank dramatically. You're tied to your fields, your village.
You're not roaming miles each day looking for food anymore.
Exactly. But contrast that with people whose role became, say, trade. The research shows their networks could explode, connecting them to totally different communities, distant villages, eventually even linking whole empires.
So settled farming created both tighter local connections and, for some people at least, vastly wider geographic connections.
Both shrinking and expanding networks, depending on who you were.
Okay, so we've got settlement, hierarchy, inequality, new health challenges, complex changes to networks. Given all these potential downsides, working harder, maybe being less healthy, living with more conflict, the question just looms larger. Why farm in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the research really emphasizes that we shouldn't imagine early farmers sitting down with, like, a spreadsheet, a pro and con list.
Right. It wasn't necessarily a simple, deliberate calculation based on predicting the future.
So what are the possibilities? Well, the research points to several factors that likely played a role. One is environmental.
Climate change.
Possibly. Maybe climate shifts at the end of the last ice age dried up some formerly abundant hunting grounds or foraging areas that could have forced people to concentrate in more limited water-rich areas like river valleys.
Where cultivating plants became a more viable, maybe necessary option.
Exactly. Another significant factor often discussed is population growth. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's a debate.
Cause and effect.
Yeah. Did agriculture emerge because populations were already growing and needed a more intensive food source? Or did agriculture, by providing a more reliable food supply, actually enable populations to grow larger than ever before?
Or both, feeding back on each other.
It was likely a complex feedback loop, hard to untangle which came first definitively.
That complexity is key. And on the point of food supply, some research does suggest farming increased the amount of food you could produce per area.
Right, allowing more people to live in a smaller space.
Maybe not necessarily the amount or quality of food per person compared to, say, a successful foraging group.
That's a finding that surprised many. But what seems clear, regardless of the per-person efficiency, is that the food supply was generally more reliable with farming.
Less risk of outright starvation.
More predictable than solely relying on what you could find or hunt each day. And that reliability likely played a major role in supporting those larger, settled populations.
And the material notes this long-term trend towards more and more intensive farming practices developing over millennia after the initial shift.
Which only amplified many of these social and health effects, both good and bad, that we've discussed.
Absolutely. So, We've looked at the mechanics, the consequences. Let's circle back to where we started, this fierce debate, the research frames. Was it better? Was this agricultural transition fundamentally a step up or a step down for humanity?
The perspectives on this have shifted so dramatically over time. For a long, long time, the story was overwhelmingly positive.
Okay.
Agriculture was seen as humanity's great triumph, an escape from a supposedly miserable, precarious, short hunter-gatherer existence. The narrative was all about gaining control over nature, achieving stability, and progressing towards civilization.
But more recent research,
Yeah.
it paints a different picture.
Yeah, drawing on evidence from anthropology, genetics, archaeology, environmental science, it really challenges that simple, positive story. There's a strong argument to be made for the advantages of that earlier forager life.
Like what? What were the upsides of foraging, according to this view?
Potentially less work overall, maybe a more varied and balanced diet, often relatively good health, aside from acute dangers, more social equality generally, lower rates of infectious disease, and perhaps more leisure time compared to the hard, repetitive labor of early farming. Yep, often ate a less diverse diet, heavily reliant on just a few staple crops.
Which could lead to nutritional deficiencies.
Right. Lived in increasingly crowded and frankly less sanitary conditions. Faced constant competition for resources, status, land, leading to more conflict.
Okay, so looking at that list, it sounds like a clear win for the foragers. Game over.
Well, not so fast. The research is quick to point out that romanticizing foraging life also misses some really important nuances.
Okay, what's the counterargument?
Precisely. While foragers might have had lower rates of some chronic or infectious diseases that plagued early farmers, they often faced much higher rates of mortality. Day-to-day risks.
Like accidents, starvation.
Think about the dangers of hunting large animals. The risk of starvation if a hunt failed or a key plant source disappeared for a season, or deaths from injury with no real medical care. They might die young more frequently, even if their average day-to-day health was better than a farmer living in a crowded village.
So maybe healthier if you survived, but survival itself was less certain day to day.
Possibly. And they weren't necessarily peaceful, noble savages either. The research acknowledges they competed for scarce resources, which absolutely could lead to violent conflict between groups.
Right.
Well, food wasn't always just lying around waiting to be picked up. Searching for it could be difficult, dangerous work. And less work time might sometimes just mean less productive time, like you spent all day looking for berries and found none.
So less work wasn't always a good thing if it meant less food.
Exactly. So it's just not as simple as one way of life being universally better. But while acknowledging the potential downsides for individuals, the research also presents these powerful arguments for the broader societal benefits that agriculture did unlock. Right. This is where we look beyond the individual farmer's maybe tougher daily grind to the collective human story. Agriculture supported populations dense enough and stable enough to allow for incredible cultural exchange.
Sharing ideas.
And the accumulation of collective knowledge over generations. The emergence of writing systems, for example, is deeply tied to the needs of managing settled communities, keeping track of surplus grain, trade, laws.
Things you don't necessarily need if you're a small mobile band.
Pretty much. And yes, it did lead to lives that in many ways offered more stability and predictability compared to constantly moving to find food. That reliability, even if the diet was poorer, freed up human energy in new ways.
And that energy, that stability, that food surplus,
Yeah.
that's what allowed for the truly monumental achievements of complex societies we see throughout history.
Incredible architecture, widespread literacy eventually, codified laws, organized religions, sophisticated art, mathematics. The material mentions the example of Petra, that monastery carved into the cliffs.
Yeah.
Something like that requires settled life, surplus resources, specialized labor, organization on a massive scale. These kinds of things were built quite literally on the foundation laid by agriculture.
Okay, so if we try to pull all this together then, the transition to farming wasn't simply a step up or a step down the ladder. It sounds like a profound, really complex transformation.
That's the key takeaway. It fundamentally reshaped human communities. It dramatically altered our networks, how we connect to each other, and it completely changed our systems for producing and distributing the things we need to live.
Our whole way of being, essentially.
It was, as the research calls it, a truly momentous transition, and it involved significant trade-offs. It really changed what work meant, what people considered basic necessities, and even what they aspired to achieve.
And considering those massive trade-offs made way back then during that shift, gaining increased reliability and the potential for complex civilization, while maybe sacrificing some individual health and equality. It does raise an interesting question for us today, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, as our own society continues to change so rapidly, driven by new technologies, new ways of working, new ways of connecting, how do we see similar kinds of trade-offs playing out in our own lives right now? What are we potentially gaining with all this change? And what might we, perhaps unknowingly, be giving up in the process?
That's a really provocative thought to end on. What are today's trade-offs?